When I'm in charge of larger Playwright end-to-end test suites, I usually like to include small little helpers that help me to ship the project with a certain quality standard. And one of these helpers is automatic network monitoring. So we have here a Playwright test case that failed only because during the test run, Playwright figured out that there was a failed HTTP request. So we're talking here for 4s, 500s, these requests that usually shouldn't happen in your application. And if you now wonder how you can set up this magic for your Playwright end-to-end tests too, this video is for you. Let's go. Let me show you a pretty basic Playwright test case here in my VS Code. The Checkly community test navigates to checklyhq.com, it clicks some links, and then at the end we expect that we end up on the URL checklycommunityslack.com. If we now run this test case with the Playwright VS Code extension, we see that everything is working properly, but this test case here isn't doing any network monitoring yet. And we could now go in here and we could start messing around with the page object, but that's no fun. So let me show you a better approach. If you look closely, you will see that this test case here isn't using test and expect from Playwright test, but rather a base file. And this means that this Playwright project is relying on Playwright's extensibility and Playwright fixtures. If you haven't heard of Playwright fixtures, don't worry, I will explain what they are and how they work in this video. However, if you want to discover more Playwright fixture use cases, check out this YouTube playlist. I'm a huge fixtures fanboy, and I'm sure you will find some use cases that you can put into your projects too. Let's have a look at test and expect coming from this base file and implement some basic network monitoring in our Playwright setup. Here in this base.ts file, we are importing test from Playwright test, we are renaming it, and then we are re-exporting it as test, but we extend the core functionality coming from Playwright. Currently, there's nothing in here yet, but we will fill this with life in just a moment. And then we also export expect coming from Playwright test, because we're not talking about extensibility of the expect functionality here in this video. But theoretically, you could add your own assertions and tweak how expect behaves in your Playwright projects. And because this file now exports the same properties as Playwright test, so namely it exports test and expect, you can now go into your test files and you can just change this line to import your stuff from base, but then you have way more flexibility to add your custom stuff to your Playwright test suite. And that is actually pretty sweet. So let's get started adding some network monitoring. As a first step, we can go into our base extend call and we can add a new fixture that is called pageWithMonitoring. But what is a custom Playwright fixture? With Playwright fixtures, you can pretty much bring in your own dependencies into the Playwright test runner and then access these from within your test cases. pageWithMonitoring here is an async function that also has this use argument. And whatever we call use with will pop out in our test cases. Now we only have to make TypeScript happy because right now it's complaining about pageWithMonitoring not being defined here in this base extend call. So we can say pageWithMonitoring will be of type page because we're calling here the use function with the page, which is normal Playwright stuff. And now thanks to this little definition here, we can go into our test case and check this out. We can now go in here and say, hey, we don't want to use page. We want to use pageWithMonitoring instead, which right now is only the normal page, but you get the idea. So let's rename pageWithMonitoring to page so that we don't have to change all the source code. So this is now pretty much the same as we had before, but now we can add our network monitoring here in our fixture definition. The beauty of this setup is that whenever now a test wants to use pageWithMonitoring, we can add our own setup and tear down instructions here in a single place without having to do it in all our test cases. So if we now want to start adding network monitoring on this page object, we can place that right here. If we now want to watch out for failed HTTP requests, we can go in here and we can say, hey, page, on any response, please add this event handler, and then we can access the URL and the actual status code of all the requests that are made in our test cases. So let's add also some logging here and log out all the URLs, and then we can check if this is already doing what it's supposed to do. If we now head over to the terminal and we call npx playwright test, we should see a whole lot of URLs happening that are all requests when we navigate checklyhq.com. So this seems to be working all right. And because we have access to the status code, we can now go in here, we can say if status greater equal 400, so a red status code, please do something here. And because we're in the scope of this pageWithMonitoring function, we can reuse the same variable here in all places. Let's say we have a variable that is called failed requests, and it will be an array, and we now push our status and our URL into this array. And now we only have to set it up. So let's go here and say const failed requests equals an array, like so. And we want to do proper TypeScript. So let's say that this will be an error request array. Here we go. Now, whenever a test is using pageWithMonitoring, we set up this array, we set up this event handler that automatically listens to red status code responses, then it runs this test case. So at the end, we only have to go here in the teardown step and check after the test is done if there were any failed requests. So we can say if failed request length greater 0, we want to throw an error. So throw new error that tells us what's up. Hey, there were failed requests. Here we go. But if we now have a failing test case with this error message, we don't necessarily know what is up and what requests have been failing. And for these use cases, I like to use test attachments. So what you always can do in your fixtures or your test cases is you can use the test info object. And with this test info object, you can always call attach and add files to your Playwright test reports. So in this case, we're serializing the failed requests array and we attach it to this Playwright test report so that we don't have to check the trace files for our failing HTTP requests. So let's head back to the terminal and let's run npx Playwright test again to see what happens. So we're still logging all the URLs that includes all the requests, but we have here a passing test case. So what's up? If we now go back to our spec file, so here we go. First of all, we're only running this test case, and I'm pretty sure that checklyhq.com doesn't have any red requests going on right now. But here's the thing. Right now, our network monitoring relies on the pageWithMonitoring fixture. And if I now go to other test cases, I wouldn't want to change all the page fixtures usage to use pageWithMonitoring. I want to have network monitoring automatically and all the time. So let's head back to our base file and add the final step here. So in our first attempt, we defined pageWithMonitoring and passed in a async function directly. But if you want to configure your fixtures, you can also always wrap everything into an array. So here we go. And you can pass another configuration object. And here we could now say that we want it to be an automatic fixture. Usually when you define your fixtures here in the base extend call, your defined code will only run when test cases decide or define that they want to use your fixtures. Automatic fixtures will run regardless if tests decide to use pageWithMonitoring or not. This means that we can now go back into our spec file, we can remove this pageWithMonitoring because this code will run regardless if we use it here or not. And now we have two test cases that if we run them, so let's go here and do npx Playwright test. Let's see, yeah, this looks good. So we should now have one passing and one failing test case, and we should have all the required info to debug this in just a moment when we check out the Playwright test report. So here we have the passing Checkly community test case. So there are no mentionable attachments going on here. But if we go back to our demo shop, which unfortunately I discovered includes a broken request, we see here that we have our error, hey, there were failed requests. And when we now navigate down here to the attachments, we have here our failed requests JSON. And here we see that there is a JavaScript file that has the status code 403. So with this setup, you can automatically start monitoring all the requests going on in your end-to-end test. And if you want to get notified when there are any red status code in your application, I think this is a pretty nice setup. And if you agree and you want to add automatic fixtures for network monitoring or for other things to your Playwright end-to-end test suite, you can always head to Checkly Playwright examples. I'm collecting a whole lot of Playwright examples there, which come usually with blog posts and videos. So make sure to check this one out. And as a really last point here today is, if you haven't heard of Checkly and you wonder what's up with this raccoon, Checkly allows you to take your existing Playwright code base and run it on a schedule from around the globe and use it for synthetic production monitoring. So you can constantly check your production website to be the first one to know when something is off, when something is broken, so that you can quickly act before your customers notice. And as someone who is constantly worrying about production and that everything is working, This really helps me sleep well at night. And with that, we made it to the end of this video. If you have any comments or questions, drop them below. I usually answer all the comments. And I will see you soon in the next video here on the Checkly YouTube channel, talking about Playwright, synthetic monitoring, and all things shipping good stuff for the web.